You are about to enter the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast, heard exclusively on RoadrunnerRecords.com/Skull Sessions. And now, here is your host, Bob Nalbandian.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast. First off, before I get into it, I got to apologize to you all. I've gotten tons of emails from you devoted listeners asking me what the hell's been going on. I know I've taken an extra long hiatus for the holidays and to get myself situated. I just moved again back in Los Angeles and back in action. We've got a lot of great stuff happening for 2010, and I promise we're going to get a steady flow of podcasts coming at you. So we're going to go ahead and get right into it. And I got to tell you, this topic has probably been the most popular topic, or I should say the most in demand, according to the emails I received from all you guys out there. I've received so many emails in the past asking, when are you guys going to do an Iron Maiden episode? Well, here it is, ladies and gentlemen, the Great Iron Maiden Discussion. And it's a great discussion between Brian Slagel, CEO of Metal Blade Records and returning guest to these Skull Sessions, and newcomer Malcolm Dome, one of my favorite journalists growing up. I've been a huge fan of Malcolm Dome's work since the Kerrang days, and now, of course, he is one of the main editors at the great magazine Classic Rock, one of my all-time favorite magazines out there. A very, very knowledgeable guy, especially when it comes to the new wave of British heavy metal. And, I got so excited about this podcast, I didn't have him do a proper introduction, seeing that he is a newcomer to the Skull Session. So I do apologize about that, Malcolm. So we've actually made this into a two-part episode, this being part one, and part two will continue on from Peace of Mind onward. So we're going to go ahead and get right into it. This is the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast, available on RoadrunnerRecords.com/Skull Sessions, also available on theclassicmetalshow.com, and of course on iTunes and your favorite podcast directory. To subscribe on iTunes, just go to the iTunes store, type in Shockwaves, both the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast and the Shockwaves Hard Radio podcast, my sister podcast, will pop up. Go ahead and subscribe to both, and please send in those comments. And if you want to email me directly, you can email me at shockwaveskullsessions@gmail.com. So let's get right into it. This is the Great Iron Maiden Discussion with Malcolm Dome and Brian Slagel. Enjoy. First off, let's talk about how you guys basically discovered Iron Maiden, whether it be when their debut album first hit, or if it was prior to that, perhaps the Soundhouse tapes. Why don't we start with you there, Malcolm?
Well, the first time I heard Maiden was way back before they had any sort of deal, when they were a demo band. And I suppose I was rather lucky in that I was in London when Maiden were first starting out, so I got to see them at a place called the Music Machine in Camden, which was a mecca for the upcoming young metal bands of the time, run every Monday night by a chap called Neil Kay, who probably means something to a lot of people out there because he was certainly instrumental in the early days of Maiden. And every Monday, Neil would have a whole batch of bands together on the bill on the Music Machine, which is now Coco in Camden. And these included the likes of Maiden, Angel Witch and Samson. In fact, those three became the regular bands on the bill. And that's how I first got to see and hear Maiden. And ironically at the time, they were regarded as probably second to Angel Witch in terms of the band most likely to do anything. Of course, we all know what happened. So I was very fortunate right back at the beginning to be able to see that young band.
So it is true, Angel Witch were kind of the bigger band at the time when they were playing clubs, huh?
In fact, there is a famous story, and I'm still not 100% sure how apocryphal this is, but the day that EMI came and saw Maiden and signed them, actually they came along to see Angel Witch. Angel Witch were the headlining band that day. I think Maiden were the opening band, because the three of them used to sort of just basically rotate the bill. Sometimes you had Samson headlining, sometimes they would open, etc. And the day that the EMI representatives came down to the Music Machine to check out what was going on, the band they really wanted to see were Angel Witch, and Maiden were the opening band. And Maiden did a storming set, and Angel Witch was, shall we say, allegedly inebriated and didn't do a storming set. and that's when EMI's focus switched from English to Maiden.
Now, I think Kevin Hayborn told me a similar story, although I can't remember, but I thought Smallwood said that he had actually set up something for the EMI people to go down and see them too. So there's so many different stories. I can't remember if Smallwood or somebody else said that they got EMI to come down, but they knew that they were going to come down to see Angel Witch, but they really wanted to see Maiden. But I don't know. There's a lot of confusing stories. But I don't think I can go on anymore with this thing. It's because Malcolm's talking about seeing all these bands in the new wave of British heavy metal in England around that time, and that just makes me so sick. I can't bear it.
I was just fortunate enough to be here at the time. It's one of those twists and quirks of fate. I mean, the same way that people.
That's all right. Let's keep that to a minimum, please.
Right. Okay.
So Malcolm, what was the vibe there? Seeing all those bands. I mean, did people realize these bands were going to be huge, or were they just?
Absolutely not. No, none of us thought that. I think we just enjoyed the fact there was a lot of exciting young bands happening. But I remember writing my first ever live review of Iron Maiden in 1979 for Record Mirror, which seems a long time ago now, and I did predict big things for them. But did I really believe big as in terms of what's happened? No. You can never predict that sort of thing because it gets to a point where luck comes in and serendipity and so many other things. But I don't think any of us who were actually there at the time with Nwabum really genuinely thought that we'd be talking about it in 2009 and it'd be such a massively influential era and time. It's quite remarkable.
Yeah, well, I think that's one of the reasons why it did become that way. It's somewhat similar to, what was going on in, a couple of years later in LA, which the metal scene, going back to the late 70s and early 80s was just such a small, tight-knit community. None of us ever thought that, this whole thing would explode like it did. It's really truly incredible, really, how far all this stuff has come.
It is.
Brian, what about you? How'd you first discover Iron Maiden?
Well, I was of course a tape trader back in those days, and I was trading tapes with a lot of guys in Europe. And one of my friends in Sweden actually sent me, I think it was it might have been an AC/DC live show or some live show from somebody like that. And he said, "Oh, hey, and by the way, at the end of this tape, there's this new band from Iron Maiden that just put out this thing called the Soundhouse Tapes. You might like them." And I heard it, and I was like, "Ooh, wow, this is really interesting." And that's kind of when I first, I'd heard that there were some rumblings of these bands happening in England, but I hadn't really known too much. And then my friends over there who I was trading tapes with would start, sending me the Maiden Soundhouse tapes, and then some of the early Def Leppard singles and some of that stuff. So I started to hear some of those things. But I first heard the Soundhouse tapes on the end of something. I thought it was interesting. It wasn't anything that I was like, "Ooh, this is going to be my favorite band of all time." But I thought it was interesting. And then when the first record came out not that long ago, that's when it kind of cemented it for me, at least.
So what were your thoughts on the first record?
Well, it was a life-changing experience for me, really. I mean, I was, it's funny because I was in high school and I was doing this tape trading stuff, but I was into a lot of different styles of music. I loved, AC/DC and Kiss and Aerosmith and all that, 70s metal stuff, but I was also into punk, I was into the local, Dead Kennedys and the Germs and Boingo Boingo even, and all these kind of bands that were playing around LA. So I had a diverse thing of liking all sorts of different styles of music, and I put on that first Iron Maiden record when it came out, and I remember to this day, I see it clear as day, sitting at my kitchen table listening to it through the stereo and just being, this is the greatest thing I've ever heard in my entire life. I mean, it was like, this is it. This is the type of music that is the most incredible thing ever. And from there on out, I became a huge Maiden fan. But that really was kind of what solidified me to really, really get into the whole metal thing full force. I mean, they said I was really into it there, but I was into kind of these other styles of music too. And once I heard that, I said, that's it. Only metal. Forget everything else.
Right. What about you, Malcolm? I mean, obviously seeing the band in the clubs prior to the first record coming out, what was your reaction when you first heard the debut Maiden album in 1980?
Oh, I loved it. Absolutely loved it. I was fortunate enough to get what was then in those days a white label copy of the vinyl.
Do you have that, Brian?
Sorry, Brian.
No, I'm sorry. That was me. I was just asking Brian, do you have that white label copy?
No, absolutely not.
Ooh, another thing you could be envious about. All right, continue, Malcolm.
But I loved it. I thought it represented everything that Maiden had been in the clubs and in the bandwagon and so forth for a period at that point of about a year, because it had the energy, the dynamic, the power. I know that subsequently Steve Harris has been very critical, to say the least, of the production, but I think it was exactly what they needed at the time. And it was raw. It was very much a live performance, and came in at number 5 in the UK charts. I think it was at that point that everybody realised this thing called the Wobbum really did have legs, and it wasn't just a tiny little corner of the musical environment that most people would laugh at and it would go away. So I think it was significant, in fact. It was at that time, suddenly everyone went, whoa, this really is starting to happen. And I do recall the day it hit number 5 in the charts, walking into a park around the corner from where EMI's offices were at the time in the West End, and there were the Maiden guys in there, looking almost dazed but elated by the fact that, hang on, this is something real. We're quite successful now, and thoroughly deserved to. It represented what they were doing live at the time, and having seen them do all those songs for so long, it was, to me, a great representation.
It's interesting, too, to look back on that first record. One thing that I think kind of, tied everything together for me, too, just as a fan, was, not only were they a metal band, but they had a lot of punk influences, and, the kind of the melding of the punk and the metal was really interesting to me because I like both brands of music. And then you have to come in and tie in the whole visual aspect, too, with, tying in the whole horror movie thing, which is another thing that I was a big fan of as well. So you kind of tie all the things I really liked into this just phenomenal package that was almost really the perfect metal band, and just with everything around it. And it was extreme, too. Back then, at least, maybe it's a little bit different in the UK, but certainly to, me living in Los Angeles, like, wow, the music was extreme. The front cover was this crazy, dead guy. And, all of it was over the top, extreme, and, just really phenomenal. They were pushing the envelope, not only musically, but visually, too, I think, if you look all the way back to that time.
Malcolm, how long after was Maiden signed after Def Leppard? Did Def Leppard were they like one of the first bands out of the new wave of British heavy metal to get a major deal?
Well, of course, if you talk to Joe Elliott, he hates the term metal. Well, we're never part of the new wave of British heavy metal. We're not metal. We're bloody rock.
Right.
However, of course, that's a load of old nonsense. And I think it's an insult that Joe keeps saying this. You should have realised at the time, they were very much a part of the Wobbum. They were part of the new wave of British heavy metal. Like it or not, Joe, you were. End of story. And Maiden and Leppard were almost on a par. One came from the north, from Sheffield. The other came from London. And I think the chronology was that they got signed around about the same time. I wouldn't like to guess which exactly signed first. I would suspect it would be Maiden.
I think Maiden got signed right before Def Leppard. It was,
I think you're right.
Like Malcolm said, it was all around the same time. Like they got signed, and I'm trying to remember the first band that was it Saxon that got signed first?
Yeah, Saxon had the very first. Well, they were on Carrere, which was an independent label, but a very successful one, and they had the first Saxon album came out in 1979, so that was the first album from the Wobbum band. So they were the first band to actually have something out. And then you had Metal for Mothers coming out, the compilation, followed by the Maiden album, and then the Leopard album. So it's all around the same period. And, of course, the third strand was supposed to be Diamond Head, and we all know, unfortunately, it never quite happened for them. But Leopard and Maiden, I think you're right. I think Maiden just edged getting the deal.
Well, it's funny here in the States. I mean, obviously Leppard really got the push. Even back then, they were still kind of underground, but I know radio stations were playing Wasted, not often, but there were a couple, you might remember, Brian, a couple rock radio stations that were playing it. I think pretty soon after the record came out, they were here in the States. Def Leppard were touring with Pat Travers, I believe, here in the States.
Yeah, well, Def Leppard was definitely the first band of the new wave of British heavy metal to come to the States to play live. Because I've seen them at the Santa Monica Civic. Was it Pat Travers or was it
Pat Travers on
UFO.
the West Coast. I know UFO, Maiden played with UFO, but of course Maiden didn't come out to the States until Killers.
That was not until 1982.
Yeah. When Killers came out, Maiden opened for UFO at the Long Beach Arena. You were at that show, Brian, right?
Yeah, I was there. I was there. In fact, I had, we'll get into this a little bit later, but I had a very interesting conversation with Paul Diano that night. But we'll wait for the Killers topic to go through that.
All right, well, to touch up on the first album, I was probably about 14 or 15 at the time, and I remember, like I said, Def Leppard made a huge impact. I think that was probably the first new wave of British heavy metal record I picked up, and it was funny because obviously this was before Kerrang. I never got into sounds. I never bought imports, although the first import I bought was Metal for Mothers. When it first came out, I think Castle Donington Castle Donington came out domestic, the compilation. That kind of introduced me to Saxon. But then the Metal for Mothers came out, so I kind of knew about Iron Maiden, although I wasn't that crazy about those songs compared to the songs, after I later got the first album. But the other bands that was funny, I had bought Wheels of Steel by Saxon. I mean, it was just such an incredible time because, as Brian says, you had, Judas Priest and AC/DC were the closest things to that new wave of British heavy metal sound. And, growing up on Sabbath, Priest, and Purple, and Rainbow, and loving those bands, you were just waiting for something new. And it just came out at the perfect time. And it was, little blurbs I would read in Circus and Cream magazine. And the bands that they would talk about were the bands that were released domestically. The Def Leppard, Saxon, Iron Maiden, and the other band that not too many people even realize to this day was Marseille. They had a record out in the States. And that was probably the second album I bought. I think that might have been even before Maiden. I can't remember when that came out. But I remember the Def Leppard, and I remember seeing the first Iron Maiden. We were at Music Market. I was with my buddy Mike Murray. This was a store in Costa Mesa that Lars used to shop at when he was living in Newport Beach before I knew who Lars was. He used to buy everything up. As soon as there'd be a record come out, they'd always say some Danish kid just bought it, and it ended up being Lars.
Yeah, that would really piss me off because we were all competing to get all. It was as you well know, Bob, it was me, Lars, and John Kern-Ahrens, and there was usually one copy of something would come in, and he had infiltrated all these stores, and he would get the stuff before the rest of us. Where we used to get
typical
mad at
Lars.
Exactly.
You order 3 copies, please.
Well, the funny thing, that was exactly it with the Maiden record, is that there was one copy there, and my buddy, Mike Murray, was looking through the I section, and he found it, and I heard him yell from across the record store. We ran over there, and he's holding up the cover. Me, him, and another guy were literally grabbing the album, fighting for it, yelling, I'm buying it. He of course ended up buying it. And then, I think I bought another album. We all went home and we bought blank tapes, and we just ended up taping all this stuff and just listening to that Maiden album over and over and over, just freaking out about it. But that was the enthusiasm there. I remember it was just such a special day just to see the Iron Maiden record and to see that album cover and just staring at it for like 10 minutes. Like, fuck.
Somewhat of a miracle that it actually, you were able to find it out here. So, because I started working at the record store right before Killers came out, and the first thing I did was call, this import company called Important. I said, okay, you need to get me everything by this band called Iron Maiden. They're like, who? I said, Iron Maiden. I said, can you spell that? I said, here it is. Get me everything you can possibly find on this band. And they're like, what? Okay, well, we'll try to find something for you. And a couple of days later, they said, oh, yeah, we have some stuff. I'm like, give me all of it. Send it all.
Yeah, well, that's the funny thing, because I guess in the States it was EMI Harvest. It was almost treated like an independent label. It wasn't that available. I mean, Music Market, of course, they dealt in imports, and it was a huge record store, an independent. You couldn't find Iron Maiden at the chains. You were able to find Saxon at a few of the chains, Wheels of Steel, and of course when Motorhead Ace of Spades came out, that was at a few of the chains. And I bought that when it came out. That was another one that blew my mind. But even the Marseille record was more available than the first Iron Maiden record.
That's interesting.
Well, yeah, there was all that. Like More was another band that I think was on MCA.
Right, the Warhead album. That was
right around that same time. The Maiden record, I think, only came out in the States because it had done well in the UK, and EMI kind of forced them to put it out. But you're right, they were just like, well, we'll just put it on this Harvest thing, whatever that is, and they didn't really do much of it. And, they continued into Killers, where, they really didn't do much on Killers, and I was a big proponent of that record when I was working at the record store too. But we'll get into that again in a moment.
Well, let's get into Killers.
We're jumping the gun here.
I mean, have you said?
Hey, Malcolm. Malcolm. Where is Dennis Stratton now?
Dennis, he pops up every so often, but he really isn't doing much at all. He's not really done much for years. He's one of those figures that just drifted away. When obviously the whole thing went down when he was fired from Maiden, and he started Lionheart and did one or two other projects, but nothing ever really stuck, which makes you think, well, actually, did he really have what it took in the first place? Same with Paul Di'Anno in a way.
Yeah, sure.
But I don't know what Dennis is doing now.
Dennis did do some stuff in like the early 90s with Praying Mantis for a
He did,
while.
yes.
Yeah.
And he'd pop up every so often doing charity things on behalf of Clyde Burr, which is great. But he hasn't really done anything significant musically for many years now.
Yeah, it's a shame. I didn't really care for the Lionheart stuff. I thought that was much too soft.
Very different to Maiden, obviously. And I think Lionheart had a shot at it at one point in the early 80s, but it never really panned out for them. It was in the Wobham supergroup that never was, like Dogmagog.
Right.
If anyone remembers that. Abortion.
And one last quick thought on the first album, Phantom of the Opera, still I think to this day is one of the greatest songs ever written by a metal band. And it's so cool when they played it on this last little run that they did before they stopped this last tour. It's just incredible. It stands up so much of this stuff, and even the first record. I think like a lot of these bands' first records, maybe it doesn't stand the test of time as well as some of the older stuff, but that song still, I think, today is just a phenomenal song.
Still my favorite Maiden song.
Absolutely. That just blew me away. And again, the production wasn't that great if you listen to it now, but back then it was just raw and heavy. And that song in Transylvania, the instrumental in particular, just blew my mind. And the thing about it, I got to say again about the new wave of British heavy metal bands is I think it was really the last movement that really showed a real diversity in metal. It wasn't like grunge or new metal where all the bands sounded the same. I mean, you had Iron Maiden, you had Saxon, you had Def Leppard, you had Diamond Head, you had Angel Witch, you had Motorhead. All these bands sounded completely different. They definitely all had their own identity, particularly Iron Maiden. It sounded like a lot of the prog metal just speeded up, real raw and heavy, and I think that attracted a lot more of the musicians, where a lot of people said, wow, this is really incredible stuff. A lot of Rush fans and other prog people, and even some of the fans of Yes and other bands like that were getting into Iron Maiden.
A lot of progressive stuff there. I mean, look, one of the big influences of Maiden was Jethro Tull, which is, very progressive sort of thing, too.
Absolutely.
Well, I mean, Steve Harris has always been a big prog rock fan. He's unashamedly name-checked the likes of Genesis and Jethro Tull as being huge influences on him. So he's never hidden that.
Yeah, definitely shows. But again, with Paul Di'Anno and the punk edge, I mean, it's like they brought all these different styles together and created something really, truly new and unique. I mean, again, like Brian, when I first heard that record, it was like, what is this? There is nothing else that, sounds like this.
Yeah.
Yep, and then, of course, to segue into Killers, they took it to the next level with Killers. So I wanted to ask Malcolm something. I'm a huge, I think maybe half of all of my favorite records of all time were all produced by Martin Birch. I kind of remember the story, but you'll tell it way better than I will. How did Maiden get in touch with Martin Birch to produce Killers?
As far as I can recall, I think it was a combination of they wanted a proper producer because they didn't like the first album's production. And obviously Martin Birch had worked with the likes of Deep Purple. He was known at EMI. And his name, I think, came up. And it was someone that Steve Harris particularly wanted to work with. And I don't think we should ever forget that Steve Harris has been the guiding light and the driving force of Maiden since day one. And what Martin Birch brought to Maiden was that ability to take them to another level while also allowing them to develop at their own pace and speed. But as far as I can recall, I think it was a case of Steve Harris wanted him, EMI knew where to find him, and it was a marriage, made in heaven, really. Literally. But I don't think there's anything esoteric to it. I think it was just one of those situations where not worked really out particularly well on the first album. Let's get in a proper producer now. Let's get in someone who really can push us. And I think it also, ironically, the arrival of Martin Birch is the beginning of the end for Paul Di'Anno.
Oh, you think that had a lot of effect in the studio?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, I love the first two albums. They're still my favorite two Maiden albums. However, I totally understand why they needed to get rid of Paul Di'Anno to move to the next level, because had Paul stayed, it would have been the end of Maiden.
Yeah.
He just couldn't do it. He was erratic. He wasn't able to deliver it in the studio to the level that Martin Birch demanded, which the other guys could. Remember, by that time, Adrian Smith had come in to replace Dennis Stratton, so we had the next level of Maiden. And I think it was when Di'Anno started to get found out, although I don't think you can hear it on the album, because I still think he does a great job on the record. However, I think it was really the beginning of the end of Di'Anno's tenure with Maiden.
Did Dennis Stratton actually start on the Killers record, the recording? And was
No. He'd gone by then.
No, he
Adrian
was
Smith
gone
was
by
in-
then. Adrian Smith was, I think, was touring with them even towards the end of the first record.
Yeah.
By the way, I am jealous of Martin and his white label copy, but I do have all of the Urchin singles, though. So.
Oh, well, Urchin were a good band, actually. One of those bands, who knows, maybe with a bit of luck could have gone a lot further. You know, there were so many bands, and as in every era, there are loads of young bands around with a lot of talent who never get the lucky break. And, of course, people say, what's the difference between Def Leppard and Iron Maiden and everybody else? Part of it's management.
Sure.
Got to say, I mean, Rod Small and Andy Taylor.
Right place, right time, Thrive, all of the things that make that successful. And for those of you who don't know what Urchin is out there, that was Adrian Smith's first band, and they released, I think, I forget, 4 or 5 singles. One of them, there's only like 15 or 20 of them in existence, and I actually have one.
Well, that's not bad going. I'm quite impressed with that.
So what's your story on, go ahead, Brian, you tell a story about Paul Di'Anno?
Well, yeah, it's funny because, you know, when Maiden came over to the States, you know, they first opened for Judas Priest, and they weren't scheduled to do any West Coast dates, so I flew from L.A. to Houston, which is the first time I ever flew to Houston. It was a horrible place, to see Maiden, and they were amazing. I, you know, interviewed Steve Harris, which was, you know, this was what, 1981, I guess, right? Or 8?
Yeah, 81 was the Killers.
Yeah, 1981. So I was, you know, barely 20. So I was, you know, it's scary to interview him. He was a super nice guy and signed my Soundhouse tapes and everything. And I talked to Di'Anno as well, who was also really, really cool. And I hung out with Di'Anno a little bit more than Steve Harris because I think at that point I was just too nervous to talk to Steve Harris because I'm such a huge fan. But, you know, Di'Anno was really cool, and I ended up, you know, becoming good friends with him. And when they came to L.A., opening for UFO, that was like, I think the L.A. date was the last, or one of the last dates on the bill.
I think you're right.
And, you know, we were just hanging out with Di'Anno, and Di'Anno had said, like, I'm leaving the band after this tour. We're like, what? He said, yeah, I'm out of here, I'm leaving the band. And we were like, why? He said, it's, you know, I want to do something more melodic, and this is too heavy for me, and I really want to be able to sing more. And we were just like, John Cornelius was with me as well. We were just sitting there like dumbfounded, like, oh my God. Because at that point, you know, when Killers came out, that, you know, to me, really took everything to the next level for Maiden. I thought just everything about that record was what the first record was, but even more. I mean, just more extreme, more heavy. You know, I mean, the album cover still to this day is one of my all-time favorite album covers ever. Just unbelievably brilliant. And, you know, songs like Murders in the Rue Born, and just phenomenal. And, you know, Di'Anno had that anger and fire and angst that we all love. And he was going to leave. And it's funny because, you know, when he left, you know, I was working at the record store at that point, selling, I think I sold 350 copies of Killers in that record store, by the way.
At Oz?
It was funny. I was calling Capitol to get me all this, like, they were sending me all this promo stuff. I still have tons of it lying around. I had an entire wing of the store that was just dedicated to that record, which didn't make the owner very happy, but I was able to do it anyway. But, you know, it's funny because he said he was going to leave, and we're all shocked that he was leaving. And, you know, word started to get out. And when I was working at the record store, you know, because we all knew Samson as well, because I told a ton of Samson. I was a big fan, actually, of Samson as well. And so we all knew Bruce, and everybody to a T in that store was like, it's going to ruin Maiden, and this is going to be terrible, and Di'Anno was the guy. And, you know, even after Number of the Beast came out, I still remember people arguing, you know, who's better, Dickinson or Di'Anno.
Well, they still do till this day.
No, well, a little bit, but I mean, look, you know, Maiden is so, you know, now Bruce, that I think most people forget that Di'Anno ever was really even in the band, especially since Paul really didn't go on and do, you know, he had a reasonable career for a while, but, you know, nothing to the extent of Maiden now. But I think that, you know, clearly, you know, the Killers record established Maiden as a real worldwide successful band, not only in the UK.
Definitely. What about you, Malcolm? What were your thoughts of Killers?
Tremendous. I remember when Killers came out, there was a bit of a backlash over here, and some of the reviews were a bit negative, and having praised Maiden so much, it's almost like that some people felt it was their right and duty now to be critical. But I thought it was better than the first album. I think over a period of time it has actually stood up quite brilliantly. And everything was taken to another level. It was taken almost as far as it possibly could go with Paul. And I think overall it really did put the cap and the seal on that phase of Maiden's career. And I think it stood up superbly well. I think it's well produced. I think it's superbly played. Great songs, really heavy, really powerful. And you can hear even more the progressive nature of Harris's influences coming through. So for me, it really is one of the great metal albums.
It's funny, when I first got it, I absolutely loved it, bought it, the day it came out, saw them live at the, opening for UFO at the Long Beach Arena, totally blown away. And UFO was one of my all-time favorite bands. And after seeing Maiden, blow away UFO, you really felt that this is the new music, this kind of music is bound to take over. It's funny though, listening back to the Killers record, I really don't listen back to it that many. There's really not too many songs I really love. I mean, I love Murders in the Rue Morgue, I love Killers, I love Wrathchild. Apart from that, I thought the record, I still see that the band was still kind of developing. What was the story, Malcolm, with Ides of March? I mean, that, of course, was originally a Samson.
Well, there's the controversy because obviously it was, I think it was co-written by Thunderstick and Steve Harris. Thunderstick, who was actually at one point an Iron Maiden drummer. Right. There were so many interchanges between Maiden and Samson, it gets a bit confusing. Half of Maiden had played with Samson and vice versa. And I think Thunderstick, when he was the drummer in Maiden, co-wrote it with Steve Harris. And then it became something for Maiden, something for Samson. And of course, Maiden were the first people to put it on record as the Ides of March, although Samson were using it as the intro at the time. So I don't think it was a case of Maiden ripping it off from Samson or vice versa. It's just that it was written by members from each band together and then adopted by each band. But of course now it's just known really as a Maiden intro.
Sure.
And a great way to open a record. And I think you've got a point, Bob. I think the interesting thing with Killers is it's great as a record. But cherry-picking individual songs, the impact isn't as great as listening to the album in its entirety. Exactly. And I think that's the difference between the first album and Killers. The first album, you can cherry-pick songs. You can listen to Phantom of the Opera, Running Free, Iron Maiden, as individual songs, and they work. But I think the beauty of Killers was it worked as an entirety.
True.
Hey, by the way, you said vice versa twice, which is also a great sample.
Yeah, I know. I noticed that.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Yes. And, of course, something with Bruce.
Right.
Bruce Dickinson. But it's remarkable how many of each played with the other. I think it's only Paul Samson and Steve Harris who didn't end up in each other's bands. Quite remarkable.
Now, there was something I wanted to ask you, Malcolm, because obviously you were in England at the time, and I'm sure you knew the band. I think it was after the Killers record, there were all that rumors about Dave Murray leaving, and in fact, I remember on the preview issue of Metal Forces, they had, Murray quits Maiden.
Yes, I think that was complete nonsense from day one. It's never even based on a proper rumor. I think Metal Forces wanted to get people's attention, so they came up with Murray quits Maiden, although it was never true. It was utter rubbish from day one. They'd invented it.
Oh, really? Oh,
yeah, that was back when the UK press loved to do things like that.
And of course, it did get people's attention. And to this day, well, people still think, was it true? Dave Murray was going to quit? No way. It was a complete lot. But of course, the problem is, even when you retract something like that, people remember the original and think, well, it's got to have some truth in there. Surely they didn't make it up totally. But yeah, it was totally made up.
Well, should we move on to Number of the Beast, 1982? Of course, Bruce Dickinson, known as Bruce and Samson, joins Iron Maiden. What was your reaction, Brian, when obviously you mentioned that Paul mentioned to you that he was leaving Maiden, but you probably had no idea at the time that Bruce was joining. What was your reaction when you first heard about this?
Well, it's kind of weird because, I was such a huge fan of Killers. And by the way, Killers' album cover is still the best Maiden album cover and one of the best metal album covers of all time, in my opinion at least. But, it was weird because I loved Killers, but I also was a big Samson fan. I loved Shock Tactics and, all the Samson stuff. So I thought, well, that's an interesting fit for Maiden. but, you know, I wasn't really sure what to think about it. You know, I didn't hear the demos or anything, just heard he was in the band. I said, well, I'll wait and see. And then they released the greatest heavy metal album of all time, in Number of the Beast, and that pretty much allayed all or any of my fears at all when I heard that record and thought, this is the greatest album I've ever heard when it first came out. And it's still, to this day, the greatest album I've ever heard. Still my favorite album of all time. And Hallowed Be Thy Name is still my favorite song of all time, not only Maiden song, but song of any form of all time. So I think, you know, for me, that just kind of cemented Maiden even further as being my favorite band, and I thought Bruce fit in absolutely perfectly on the album. And where Bruce also really fit in was live. I mean, live, he really took them to a whole nother level. As much as I love Paul, and I like what Paul did, you know, he was not the greatest frontman live, and Bruce was almost the opposite, just a brilliant, phenomenal frontman. And, you know, that's really, I think, what cemented Maiden as being, you know, one of the biggest and best bands of all time.
All right. Malcolm, your thoughts? Number of the Beast.
Well, I think when Di'Anno was announced as leaving Maiden, and then they announced that they had, it was an open secret at the time of Reading 1981 that they were talking to Bruce about replacing Paul in Maiden. Everybody knew that was going on. But when it was finally announced, I think there was a little bit of, what's going to happen here? People weren't totally sure. They weren't unconvinced, but they remained to be convinced. And Maiden did a Christmas show in 81 at the Rainbow in London, and it wasn't sold out. But Bruce did a decent job. But I think the general opinion was, let's wait and see what the album's like. And, of course, it turned out to be Number of the Beast, which I think is the most important metal album of all time. I think it was so significant and crucial in crystallizing everything and taking it forward. And it gave a purpose and a focus to not just the Wobbin, to what was to come. And at that point, I think all doubts just blown away. Tremendous record, great vocal performance. And I think everybody realized Paul couldn't have done what Bruce did on the album. In the same way that I don't think Bruce necessarily could do justice to the Di'Anno era songs, because they weren't really his. Bruce just came in and took it to another level. And although officially he wasn't involved with the writing, he really was. And every song on an album is a masterwork. And it just came together brilliantly. And suddenly Maiden took off. Suddenly they weren't just a metal band who really had a cult following and were the darlings of the underground. Suddenly everything spread out and they were a big band, globally a big band.
Absolutely. Yeah, Number of the Beast is my favorite Iron Maiden record, too. And I think, you know, you mentioned how it is such an important metal album. You say the most important metal album. I think people don't realize that because at the time, it really was. I mean, it was just a breakthrough metal album, and it just really showed that metal is alive and newer, stronger, better than ever. And that album in the States, I remember, was kind of a big deal when it went gold. I remember reading some in the LA Times about metal's coming back, the return of heavy metal, and that album kind of set the standards. And they added on two records. It was that album, and I believe Scorpion's Blackout. They just went gold in the States, and that was kind of a big thing at the time.
And really, to echo Malcolm's, you know, thing about this being the most important metal album of all time, I completely agree, because without this, I mean, this was, again, an extreme, they were an extreme band at the time. Like, forget Slayer, forget Metallica, forget all these other bands that came after them. Like, Maiden was the one that really took up the torch, because the torch was never really passed from Sabbath and, all those bands, and Maiden really picked that up. But they were an extreme band. And without Maiden, there is no Slayer, there is no Metallica, there is no Pantera, there is no Killswitch Engage, on and on and on. I mean, none of those bands exist if Maiden does not put out a record like Number of the Beast, which, was a hugely commercial successful record, but also a very, at the time, extreme record. And, I think part of the reason why it was successful was also because of, people thought it was extreme and the lyrics and, all that nonsense about devil worship, all this other garbage. But it was a very extreme record for the time, and that definitely paved the way for all these other bands to come after them, absolutely, and to be a successful mainstream act, for something that, underground and extreme, to come from completely the underground of nowhere and to get out in a scene like that and to have all this commercial success. Absolutely. Nothing that the way metal became the way it is now, where it's a genre that is not ever going away. It's a household name. It's a household word. People know what it is. There's all these different bands. That never happens without Number of the Beast.
True.
No, you're right. Absolutely.
The key is, too, it's not just that it's extreme. I mean, the thing about Maiden is they had a great deal of melody, and more importantly, they had songs. I mean, there were bands, you could say the Sex Pistols and a lot of these punk bands were more extreme than Maiden. Yeah, they didn't have musicianship. They didn't have the songs like Maiden did. Maiden had brilliant musicianship, a great ear for melody. I mean, and a very 70s influence from whether it be the prog bands or bands like Deep Purple and Sabbath, but it was just with a real modern feel. And yes, they did add some extremeness to it, but it wasn't the fact that it was, extreme like Motorhead or Venom. I mean, Maiden were much more diverse musically. I mean, at times they could be as heavy as any of the bands of that era or heavier, but they just had brilliant songs. And I think this album, Number of the Beast, proved it. And I think with Bruce Dickinson, I mean, I was skeptical too. I mean, I was a huge Bruce Dickinson fan. I think Shock Tactics, still to this day, one of the most underrated hard rock or rock records for that matter. I think that is probably Bruce Dickinson's best vocal performance ever. I mean, he just sings his ass off on that record. And I always loved Paul Samson's style, very bluesy style, and just, again, really good songs. So here you have two great bands, and I'm thinking, how is this going to work? I was excited. One of my favorite, it was very similar when Dio joined Sabbath, because here Rainbow Rising and Long Live Rock and Roll, two of my all-time favorite records, as well as Sabotage and some of the Sabbath records with Ozzy, and you're like, is this going to work? And just like when Heaven and Hell came out, it was just magical, the same way as Number of the Beast. I mean, Bruce adapted to the sound and he made it his own. And he really changed. And I think that's what kind of pissed off a lot of the Di'Anno fans is it didn't quite have that punk edge to it. It brought it to another level. And I think it brought it to a better level, a bigger level, particularly seeing the band live. Because like Brian said, I mean, there's no better frontman than Bruce Dickinson. And I think those videos was a key to it. I mean, they were being shown all the time on MTV, Number of the Beast and Run to the Hills. And there was nobody like Iron Maiden, and it was just a magical band and a magical album, definitely.
Absolutely. And of course, they had Eddie. Let's not forget the importance of Eddie, which
Although
is very
I didn't care
crucial.
for that album cover as much. I thought the Devil was a little bit cheesy looking.
It was. It's probably the cheapest of the first three. However, I think Eddie's importance as a visual representation became increased as time went on, and that gave them focus because as people, I mean, Bruce is very personable and very charismatic, but there's not much. They love to be very private, Maiden. And I think Eddie's presence gave them the ability to be public and to be private. So I don't think we should underestimate his importance in the whole thing. But it's interesting. I know it's a slightly wider subject, but it's interesting what you say about the way people accepted Bruce and also Ronnie with Sabbath. Would that happen these days? I'm not so sure it would. And I think it was a very different era of people much more open-minded in terms of the favorite bands and the singers of those bands leaving and giving the chance to the new guy to come in. I'm not so sure it would happen now.
I think it depends a lot on the band and who the singer coming in is. If you're replacing somebody with somebody of quality, like, Ozzy for Dio or Di'Anno for Dickinson, I think it can still happen. I mean, it's happened on, small levels, like a level of like a Kill Switch Engage where, they had some success and they switched to Howard. They obviously had this huge success since then. So it still happens every once in a while. But I do agree that, it's probably a little bit harder now because I think that stuff's under the microscope even more than before.
Well, and I'm thinking even in terms of when Priest in the 90s replaced Rob Halford with Ripper Owens, and Ripper did a fantastic job, but everyone wanted Halford back.
But you know what, though? It goes about the records, too, because if you look at Priest, I mean, you look at what they did with Painkiller, and then you look at the two albums that Ripper did, particularly Demolition, that sucked. It was, and of course, Ripper gets a lot of the flack because he's the one joining, but the albums weren't as good. Same thing with Van Halen. I mean, when the Extreme guy...
Gary Cherone.
That album was a piece of shit. But of course, he gets the blame for it. But it was a bad record. I mean, I think if Number of the Beast was a piece of shit, of course, people would be blaming, Dickinson. And the same with If Heaven and Then Hell was a piece of shit. But the fact is, it worked, and they were great records. And I think when it comes to some of those other bands I mentioned, it was like they didn't have that integrity or the drive that Maiden did back in 1982, 83. Well, all right, there you go. That ends part one of the Great Iron Maiden discussion. I know that was kind of a rather abrupt way to end the part one episode, but actually we got cut off because Malcolm had to head out. So we're going to go ahead and finish off the Iron Maiden discussion with our part two, which should be our next coming episode, which will be posted in a couple weeks on, of course, roadrunnerrecords.com/Skull Sessions.
Thanks for checking out the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast. You can download all episodes of the Skull Sessions podcast free of charge on our homepage at roadrunnerrecords.com/Skull Sessions. You can also subscribe to the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast through iTunes. Please email questions, comments, suggestions, and gripes to Bob Nalbandian at shockwaveskullsessions@gmail.com. We appreciate the support.